Good morning and welcome. I'm Jessica Morgan, Director at the Dia Art Foundation. Thank you for joining us today. A very beautiful day here in Beacon. It's a great pleasure to have people here on this occasion. I hope many of you will join us in the city on May 21st for the second part of our symposia on Ryman. I think the extended view and consideration of his work is incredibly important to us. It's obviously part of what Dia has done, focusing on the artists that we have a long relationship with. But I think for those of us who've been living with the exhibition in Chelsea, it's become even more important to think about this relationship to time and duration in relation to Ryman's work. We've been in and out of the galleries very happily, quite a privilege, I must say, every day to enter into the galleries in Chelsea and then come up to here every week and see the vast differences that take place with Bob's work according to the time of day, the time of year, the momentary passing of the cloud in the space. We're fortunate, of course, to have this natural light setting both in Chelsea and in Dear Beacon. And for those of you who have not seen either display or who have not revisited it recently, I encourage you to do so because it is always a completely different experience. It's been quite a revelation to us. In fact, I was just saying to Courtney, I feel your eyes, in fact, have been taught to read the paintings in a very different way over time. And certainly I look at the works here in Beacon very differently now that we've been living with the works in Chelsea. So I'm sure that our speakers over the course of this two-part symposia are going to bring all kinds of new considerations to the work. It was very important to us that we open up the reading of Ryman to both the scholars who've dedicated many years to studying his work, such as Rob Storr, and to new thinkers, Allegra, James Meyer, and of course Courtney Martin, who is the curator of the exhibition, to whom we're very indebted for an installation that is truly remarkable in Chelsea. So I think we have much to learn, and I hope that the readings of the work and the readings that will come in the second part of the symposia will only add to our experience of the work both here and in Chelsea. There'll be a book that will come from this two-part symposia. We're incredibly grateful to Pace Gallery for supporting the symposia that will result in a book that will come out later this year with some additional texts. And I'm going to pass over to Courtney, really, herewith, and just very lastly say thank you, as ever, to the family. Ryman's sons have been an incredibly important part of this process, and Meryl as well, his wife. And without them, we really wouldn't have been able to do this. So thank you once again, Will, Cordy, and Ethan. And over to you, Courtney. Thank you.
Hi, thank you all for coming today. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers for what promises to be a great day. I will keep the introductions brief so that we can get to this. Our first speaker is Robert Storr, a noted teacher, curator, critic, and artist. Rob was curator and then senior curator in the Department of Painting and Sculpture in the Museum of Modern Art from 1990 to 2002. There, he organized the last major museum exhibition of Ryman's paintings, which was held in 1993. In 2007, he was the first American artistic director of the Venice Biennale, and currently he is the dean of the Yale School of Art. Our second and third presenters will tackle Ryman's specific concerns of paper and dimensionality, respectively. Allegra Pesante is curator at large of the Menil Drawing Institute in Houston. A noted drawing specialist, Allegra has curated important works on paper exhibitions of Rachel Whiteread and Zarina Hashmi, among others. Her presentation today will use the classical notions of disegno and colore to focus on the significant correlation between drawing and painting throughout the painter's career. Following Allegra, I will examine the range of three-dimensional paintings that proliferate Ryman's practice. Our final address will be delivered by James Meyer. James recently left the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. to assume the role of deputy director and chief curator at the Dia Art Foundation. In James's landmark text on minimalism, which was published in 2001, he proposed that we see how Ryman and others employ anti-compositional techniques within late 20th century art. In addition to his duties at DIA, James is currently organizing the first exhibition to explore the pioneering career of gallerist and patron Virginia Dwan. This show will open at the National Gallery in September. Following James's response, we will all gather for a panel discussion and Q&A. Thank you.
So, just find my notes. Yeah. I'll just pick up from Jessica's remark, which is looking at Ryman over time is what I have done a very great deal of. And I will tell a little bit of what that means in a minute. But I'm going to do this talk extemporaneously with a few notes to remind myself of where I wanted to go when I get off on some detour. I'm going to use as a title the title of a book of criticism by William Carlos Williams called In the American Grain, which is not to stress Ryman's Americanness all that much, because in fact he is one of the American artists who is most respected outside of this country, and in some cases was more highly regarded and paid closer attention to by people outside of this country than he was within this country. However, there is an element of his work which follows in line with that idea, and that element has to do with its objectivity and its relation to objectivity and to materialism altogether. Now, I would just say on that score, right behind me on the screen, I asked the tech person to please leave blank on there. I'm going to do this without any slides. I'm going to employ ekphrasis, which is to say I'm going to describe things when I need to rather than showing them to you. And I would also add that when we were preparing the show for the Modern and also for the Tate, Bob and I worked really not with pictures at all. We worked with little thumbnail sketches that I'd made of all the paintings that I thought should be in the show. At one point we sort of thought maybe we should make an index in the back of the catalog of these little thumbnail sketches because in fact reproductions of Bob's paintings more than any other artist I know, and it's true basically of all artists, betray those paintings. There was a poor victim of all of this who was responsible for color separations for a catalog that was done in Europe prior to ours, who was hospitalized as a result of the stress of having to work out color separations over 4 sheets so that you calibrated things that came out more or less acceptable on all sheets. And of course, when you deal with Bob's work, you deal with the background white, which on a page is never white, right? It's actually a dot matrix, and it's got the full spectrum in it, and it blushes this or it blushes that. So basically, Bob's work is the single best argument for why it is that reproductions fail, for why it is that all the ideas about completely replacing, painting with pictures or pictures of paintings falls flat. Bob's painting is the most complete painting of any painter I know. I know others that are as, complete, but none that are more so. And those that are as complete are complete in ways that Bob is complete, but by different means and through different paths and for different reasons too. In any case, it seems silly to show a picture of a picture which is by definition something that cannot be pictured. What is in Robert Ryman's work is a physical address to a physical material at a certain proportion in a certain space, and each one is unique and each one is different, even when they belong to series where they are relatively related and relatively similar. And therefore, how can one do any service at all to generalize about such things? One can think about them in general terms, one can think about them in the categories that they, bring to mind in terms of the history of art and so on, but ultimately, the particular is what matters in Ryman's work, which is why I thought we should replace this with Giovanni Anselmo's projection piece, particolare, which is a little word that appears on walls wherever he puts a projector. So next time I do this talk, maybe we can get Anselmo a piece up here to look at instead of blank, because that's the other thing that this is on the wall for. There have been untold stupid headlines, stupid plays, stupid commentaries about how Ryman's work is blank. how it is a tabula rasa, it is the reductio ad absurdum, it is nothing. And of course, anybody who enters a room of Ryman's paintings knows all the ways in which that is not true the minute they walk in. So even if they come in their head with this idea that what this artist has done is to clear out everything and leave nothing, they immediately find that nothing is highly variegated, richly touched, thought, calibrated, and so on and so forth, and that nothing looks pretty damn interesting, frankly. And so that idea is one of the things one battles with. It's the elephant in the room much of the time, and so to have the word appear here to remind us that it is a nonsensical charge against his paintings is also helpful. Does somebody have a glass of water? That'd be great, or just whatever it is. Now, as I said, I'm going to sort of do this a little bit in terms of the history of my relation with Ryman's work, more so than my history of relation with Ryman, which goes for a long period of time. But my relation with Bob's work started much before I ever knew him or ever even knew that one could know him. In the 1960s, I was a young man, and I was a young man with passions about art. Most of them were connected to figuration, and in some cases to dramatic figuration. I was completely absorbed by Picasso and by the Picasso myth and by the Picasso oeuvre, which I knew very well, which, coming from Chicago, we had excellent examples of. I was also interested in Picasso in his relation to politics. Thanks. And I recall vividly coming to New York in 1967 and seeing Guernica in place along with all the studies that were there. And that was kind of my frame of reference. I was interested in Matisse and other people in the School of Paris, but Picasso was the person I did, as young men do, made a pilgrimage. I went to La Californie in the south of France after having hitchhiked down there, hoping that I could see the master. Of course, I didn't. I recall, actually, the stories that Ellsworth Kelly used to tell about how once Picasso almost ran him over on the roads in Paris and pulled the car over, having nearly done so, opened the door and apologized and then invited him into the car. And Ellsworth was so starstruck that he said, "No, thank you," and then regretted it ever since. Anyway, so I missed my chance to take a ride with Picasso, but I was a fellow traveler for a long time. I also, in 1971, went to Mexico to work for Siqueiros because I was a believer that art should be engaged in politics actively. My sense of politics then was different than it is now, but in any case, I was, in that case, involved in heroic figuration again, but grandiose and rhetorical, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, why do I say these things? Because at the end of my college education, I came to New York in 1972 to make the rounds of galleries. I started to do that pretty much in 1968. And for 4 years, we go back and forth between Philadelphia, where I was in school, and New York, where I had friends and so on, and see shows. And I walked into the Ryman retrospective at the Guggenheim in 1972. I had never heard of this artist. I was not thinking along lines that had anything to do with him whatsoever, or the aesthetic that he was involved with whatsoever, and I was knocked out. And it was the first time I'd ever experienced a kind of art for which I had no words, no precedence, and no need, actually, to explain myself. Nobody was asking me what did it mean. Nobody asked me, did I like it? Nobody asked me anything about anything. It's just that there it was, and there I was, and it made a profound impression on me. Such that when I got to the modern many years later, it was the show I wanted to do most of all. Now, I had had in-between experiences. I was very close to two women who ran the Video Data Bank, and I worked for them, Lynn Blumenthal and Kate Horsfield. And they used to rent Lucy Lepard's loft when they came to New York. And for a year that Lucy was out of town, they had it for the entire year. So when I came to work with them, which consisted mostly of making the rounds of studios, collecting slides, dealing with the artists that they had recorded already, and setting up appointments to make other recordings, I would stay in Lucy's loft as well. And I recall two things from that experience. One was a tiny little painting of Bob's that used to hang on the bookshelf by the front window. And the other thing was the Sol LeWitt drawing on the wall, which Lynn and Kate almost painted over because they didn't really see what it was and they just thought it looked kind of musty. But fortunately, they did not. In any case, here again, without any preparation, I was with works of art deemed minimal or reductive or whatever it was, and never thought about whether they were reductive or not, just was really, really engaged in what they are on their own terms. Now, there's a concept that Bob talks about a good deal, and other artists of his generation talk about a good deal, which is not, I think, discussed nearly enough now. and that is the idea of making visible. When he talks about what he does, he talks about making certain things visible by doing what he does. And what things are they? Well, for starters, they're the things within the frame of the picture. And the picture is not a picture within the frame of the work, because it's not necessarily a painting. It can be a stretched piece of fabric with lines drawn on it. It can be a piece of paper with lines drawn on it. It can be a surface covered with pigment with no lines. It can be many, many, many things. But in any case, his task is to make something visible. And to do that does something else. The minute you make a thing visible in its own self-contained terms, if you do it rigorously enough, and if you do it decisively enough, you make everything around it visible too. We've all had the experience of walking out of a movie and being so alive to the colors and to the motion of the film that suddenly our humdrum world looks utterly different to us, whether or not it has anything to do with the content of the movie. And good paintings do that. Good art in general does it, but paintings in particular do it. And they do it because they are physical in certain ways that stress the physicality of other things. Daniel Buren used to do this. He used to talk about making things visible by use of his patterned, ready-made stripes, because if you put them in the world as a marker, everything else around it was marked. And that became, therefore, an active experience, whereas previously, that is to say, before he intervened, it would be probably a passive experience. You would check off the things that you saw that you'd seen before. You would check off the new things and register the possible dangers in them and so on and so forth. But basically, the idea that what an artist does is to mark the world so that you can see it again, in addition to making a mark that is intrinsically interesting to look at, is, I think, sort of the defining principle of Bob's work and of a great many artists of that generation. Now, he said in one place, and I was actually going back through my book and I couldn't find the quotes. I'm also at this point where I've been working flat out for 20-odd years, 30-odd years, and my memory's beginning to fail me. It's just tired. So now I have the liberty of forgetting things and misremembering them and making them up. And I will arrogate to myself all the privileges of the postmodern literary world to justify my misremembering. But in any case, the phrase that I'm trying to find, or tried to find but failed, is something like this. It's never a question of what to paint, but only a question of how. The how is the image. And that, again, is a defining aspect of his work, but it also, I think, nicely moves things out of where they were in the conversation before he began to make his work. Because on the face of it, that's a formalist statement. But formalism, generally speaking, was about templates, was about frameworks, was about the way in which you conceive of the picture, or object, or painting, or what have you. It was about the form as an idea to be made, but not necessarily where the making of it mattered all that much. And in the case of Bob's work, the making of it matters entirely. It is the whole damn show. And he doesn't know when he begins something how it's going to look when it comes out. In that sense, he's a kind of interesting descant to the ideas that Saul LeWitt related to, although he and Saul were good friends and they respected each other enormously. But if Saul said that the idea is a machine for making art, Bob basically associated, at least I think, basically associated the materials at hand as being a predicate, a verb, set of verbs for the making of art. And exactly how it came to be and where it stopped was something that you worked your way into. It was intuitive. But again, back to the idea of in the American grain, it was objective. There was never a question of turning those materials to a purpose outside of what they themselves represented or were. It was not a matter of making the materials speak to transcendental things, ethereal things, unnameable things. It was a matter of making them speak very clearly in their own idiom, and of organizing the bits and pieces of these different materials within these different formats at these different scales in such a way that the materials conspired to make something that had never existed before. Now, I refer this a little bit to this in the catalog, but there used to be, and I hope still is, a marvelous wall of 8x10 glossies made by Eva Inquiry and God only knows who else, of the things that Bob made that he put on his wall after he had made them and after they'd gone out into the world to be shown. And it's a kind of wonderful timeline, mosaic line of all of these compositions. And I've always imagined, again, it's hypothetical, that in looking at these, Bob was Pascal talked about the two infinities, the infinity of addition and the infinity of division. And that in looking at these walls over and over and over, he would imagine what you could add to it at any point, or what you could open up as a parenthesis and add to by subdivision. So that the whole matrix becomes a template for thinking about something that doesn't exist, but for choosing the materials that it would allow it to exist. And then in so doing, you would have all of these things in your mind as you were doing something that was right there in front of you. Now, this way of working is pretty much against the grain of most of formalist painting in that period. And it was also pretty much against the grain of the logic of most of formalist art at that time, because he was not interested in extending the history of art by deducing or analyzing what it had been and what was missing from it. He was interested in extending the logic of his own working habits by doing something. And to take your own materials, your own circumstances, your own field of action as the primary thing, rather than to try and outsmart the history of art, which is what almost, the majority of formalist painters were trying to do in the 1960s, was a huge shift in emphasis and redirection of attention, which is not to say that he did not contribute to the history of formalist painting, it's just that that wasn't his goal. Being empirical in the way that Bob is, and being pragmatic in the way that Bob is, again, I think is a very American turn of mind. To not analyze, theorize, invent, speculate about what needs to be done for some kind of reasons that are beyond what's in one's immediate tactile range, but rather to do it in terms of, oh, this, and then this, and then this, and if you put them together, what do you have? And if you think about how Bob began to work, I mean, he was a guard at the Museum of Modern Art. He was a serious jazz student. He wanted to make music. He did not want to make paintings. And he started doing little exercises on exhibition cards that came to him and others at the Modern. And when we were doing the show, we found a few of them where you could see what was on the exhibition card on the opposite side. And sometimes if you really try, you might see something underneath the paint. But to consider that he was basically noodling, with available cheap materials. And that for a long time, he didn't really have art supplies as such. There was a store on the way from the Modern to where he had an apartment, and he would pick up materials. But he wasn't really shopping to make his art in the way that later on he became one of the great shoppers. He was looking at materials that nobody had ever made art of before, ever, and as well as becoming a master of the traditional media of oil paint, wash, and casein, and all of those things that he used. In any case, the idea that you would just sort of make it up as you go along and have the courage to make it up as you go along, I think in some ways also have the lack of ambition that people who are truly ambitious have, which is to say he was not competing with the other guys, he was trying to satisfy his own desire to do something. And he had an infinitely expandable desire when it turned out that he did in fact have a sort of a grip on something. But he was not trying to best his betters, his peers, his whatever. He was trying to make the thing he needed to make. Now, some other thoughts. Let me make sure I'm doing it on time. Bob's work is beautiful. That's an adjective. We've had a decade and a half of the beauty discourse, where people try and talk about beauty as an absolute thing, as an antidote to ugliness. As an antidote, what they really mean usually is to ideas. The Beauty Brigade, that's what I'll call it, the Beauty Brigade is composed of people who are really miffed that art got weird on them, and that art asked them to think hard about things, particularly think hard about things that they didn't want to think about at all, that they'd in fact gone into art to avoid thinking about. Again, in this generation, in the generation of Bob and of Lucy and of many other people, the separations between art and the world didn't exist as they were then sort of reinforced in the 80s and 90s, and vice versa, that the separations between common talk and exquisite theoretical talk didn't exist in the same way either. The people of that generation were fairly activist. I am a younger part of that generation, but I know this firsthand. Were fairly activist. They were fairly hands-on. They saw the world in a terrible state, And Saul or anybody else could, on the one hand, make a rarefied aesthetic object, and it was an aesthetic object. The anti-aesthetic is an invention of people who are uncomfortable with the aesthetic, not people who understand what it is. You can make an aesthetic object and at the same time go to a demonstration or participate in group organizations to deal with the housing shortage or to deal with racial injustices and so on and so forth. This generation of people approached problems as they kind of were right in front of them. And of course, everybody makes mistakes, but they made fewer than we have done in recent years. And they have refused to accept dichotomous arrangements and to keep things at war with one another in order to reinforce what they were doing. I mean, to take this, for example, two of the most generous eyes towards the art of others were two of the most demanding and rigorous artists. That's Donald Judd and Saul LeWitt. Both of them collected broadly. Both of them collected unpredictably. And both of them respected things that were totally at odds with what you would have presumed their ideas about art to be, given what they made. The enforcing of hard and fast separations between figuration and abstraction, between all these different categories that people have invented, that's something that came later. That came as an effort by critics to tidy up a world which was interestingly messy, and which the artists themselves kept interestingly messy. And in the case of Judd, he was the most interestingly messy thinker with the most curt, direct, and vernacular way of talking about these issues. He was a theoretician. He had studied philosophy. He had studied with Meyer Shapiro. He was a learned man, but he didn't talk the jargon of contemporary art criticism, and he didn't need to, because he was able to address things for what they were in his own language, and he was willing to stand his ground, and if you didn't like it, fuck you. Yeah? Just to use some art critic language. And of course, a little scotch never hurt. Now, Bob's attitude was much less pugnacious, but he himself was able to see and have an interest in things that people don't think he would have an interest in, don't think he would even see. The fact that he, has work in his house by Sylvia Mangold, by Jan Dibbets, by a host of other artists of his generation, probably goes naturally with the fact that artists exchange work. But those works are not consistent with his work. They are different, and that is, I think, probably what he savors about them. And the idea of having a logical train of thought that you then impose on everybody and everything around you in order to maintain your position is alien to the way in which he does things, because the way he does things is to make the work that he felt necessary, and he therefore respects others who make work with equal conviction that is equally necessary in its own way. Now, back to beauty. One can say that Bob's work is beautiful, and I think it is very beautiful. It elicits, not a Stendhal effect exactly, but when people see his exhibitions, they do gasp when they walk into a room. They do stop. I remember when we were touring the show from MoMA out to San Francisco, there was concern about whether there would be any audience. And I said to people, having observed it at the Modern, well, I wouldn't be too worried. No, you will not get huge crowds, but you will get unpredictable crowds. And you will see quickly what those crowds are made of, because when people walk past the door, if it's for them, they go in. They can't resist it, a little bit the way it was for me when I first saw it at the Guggenheim. And if it's not for them, it's not for them. Don't worry. It doesn't have to be for them. Maybe they'll get around to it, and that would be great. And that's why museums serve a function, because they actually reintroduce over and over and over artists that the public might conceivably engage with. But it doesn't matter. The point is, if it engages them, they won't leave these galleries for a long time. And that was true in San Francisco, it's true in the Modern, it's true here, I'm sure, too. Once people get into a room full of Ryman's paintings, not only are they stunned by them, but they can't leave them. And the best way to show Ryman's work is, of course, with other Ryman's work. You can stick him in a history of art lineup, and he'll always look good. But the best way is to teach people how to understand these works by giving them the opportunity themselves to make the comparisons among them, so that they can see how the quality of one is not repeated in the next, but actually something analogous occurs, but it occurs in a very different fashion, and it occurs in a way which is non-chronological. There's not development in Ryman's work. Trying to write about his work in that way is a futile exercise. Of course, there's a sequence, but that's not the same thing as a development. And to teach people that the way to understand works of art is to tell themselves what they're seeing in order to better see what they're seeing is the thing that happens when people are cut loose in a room. And it is the way in which people learn from Ryman's work how to look at other work. Because he is the best education for the eye that I know of. And this is a sweeping generalization, but I will stand by it. And people who are able to look at his work comparatively and engage with it without asking themselves the wrong questions, but allowing impressions and thoughts to well up as they are looking at just what is right there, are therefore empowered to do a lot of other things once they leave the gallery. And those questions that well up in them are, I think, relatively simple. Again, if you go into a Ryman exhibition and asking yourself, whither art, whither painting, you are in trouble already. You know, he, in an interview with me, as I recall, said something to the effect of, you know, after all, abstract art is only very young. If it starts roughly 1907, you know, we're only into the 107th year of it. It's a new art form in Western culture. It's not, of course, new in other cultures, but it's new in Western culture, in modern culture anyway. And therefore, why should we be so worried about its survival? Why should we think that everything is teleological in the sense that we're going to run out of juice pretty soon? If one man can make this many paintings out of, relatively speaking, the same materials, it's proof of the opposite. It's proof that it is really infinitely rich in possibility. And of course, if another man or another woman, Agnes Martin, for example, makes a number of paintings out of roughly the same materials, and they're all different, that multiplies the ways in which difference is possible within apparent sameness. The sameness is a linguistic sameness. You say white, people go, I got it. You show them whites, and they realize they don't have it. Meryl Wagner, Bob's wife, made a wonderful painting. She bought all of the Naples yellows that were available on the market, made by all the different people who make Naples yellow. And she made a series of paintings, and I remember one of them, which was, as I call, horizontal in squares, and every one of them is totally different, right? So you take the linguistic homogenizer, and you use the material reality to bust it up. And in the meantime, you've had this most beautiful spectrum of yellows, which will key your eye to seeing yellow everywhere, and to seeing differences within differences, and refinements with refinements. And let me add another anecdote. These are not the things that make connoisseurs. This is not the sort of difference within difference, refinement within refinement that is only available to people who are educated, who are thoughtful in certain ways, who are trained in academies, who are trained in workshops. This is an anecdote I've used over and over again, so I apologize if you've heard it, but I will tell you. Years ago when I was broke, I took the video data bank takes of Lynn and Kate and taught a course at Rutgers. And I showed everything under the sun. Figurative painters, abstract painters, performance artists, conceptual artists, blah, blah, blah. And there was one guy in the back of the class who had a surly look from the day one, and clearly had taken this class as a gut and was very put out that it was not so easy. And that there was nothing in it that he could immediately relate to. And there was, as I recall, we showed Rackstraw Downs and Philip Pearlstein, we saw Agnes Martin, and we saw Saul. I mean, there was a wide range of things. And none of it, you know, figurative, abstract, whatever, none of it got to him. And I took Ryman's tape, and I put Ryman's tape up, and suddenly he lit up. And of course, in those days when we showed the tapes with slides, and then slides live for all the reasons I've told you, but still, he was getting the imagery. And he was completely excited, and came up to me afterwards and dropped his surly young man look, and sort of asked about who this guy was. So at that point, it gave me an opportunity to ask him who he was. And it turns out that he had made his living as a house painter. And he could tell exactly the grades of paint that Bob was using, and the ways in which he was using them, and the surface on which he was using them, and he was grooving on it. You know? Now, if persons familiar with materials can see the poetry of what Bob's doing just because they know what those materials are capable of and how he has used them in extraordinary ways relative to that capacity, that means Bob's work is not inherently an elitist art at all. It is only limited by people who are able to take stock of the material reality and to understand how it is being used and to what purposes. So I'll speak a little bit on that. But for starters, then again, if you say that Bob's paintings are beautiful, it is not in the furtherance of the idea of beauty as the opposite of difficult, as the opposite of conceptual, as the opposite of political, as the opposite of all the things that the beauty brigade hates, right? It is fact, beauty is something manifest. Beautiful things exist, people make them. And there is a consistent enough response among people who are alert enough to what those things are that you really have a sense that this is exceptional and therefore it is worth more of your time rather than less. And therefore people who catch that, who walk past the gallery and go in and stay for a little longer than usual, or maybe a very long time, are people who are letting themselves experience beauty without having to think about it, which is the most beautiful way to experience beauty. We have privileged words to an extraordinary degree, and we have privileged arcane words to an extraordinary degree. And we have forgotten how to speak about exceptional things in the vernacular, in a spoken idiom, in a way in which people actually talk to each other and experience the world. And therefore, an artist like Ryman is in every way a provocation to speak plainly about plain things in order that you will understand how rare plain things really are, how rare beautiful plain things really are. And in terms of the logic of critique, if I understand it correctly, the word critique means to shed light on things, right? Well, Bob's work sheds light on everything around it. It sheds light on itself. It sheds light on the false premises that are thrown at it or held against it. It sheds light on extraneous blah, 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 blah talk. It sheds light on everything under the sun, and it also then reaffirms that there is something left over when you're done critiquing that can be affirmed, that is not just about taking something apart, but it's about saying something is there that is worth special attention, special respect, and that is actually fundamentally democratic. Beautiful things are critiques of ugly things, true, but they're also critiques of false ideas of beauty, and a really beautiful thing makes a lot of the metaphysics of beauty dissolve as much as it makes a lot of other things that are of another nature dissolve. Objectivity is also a critique. It's a critique of its opposite, which is vagueness, abstraction of a different order, the abstraction you can never get to. Now, I'm not going to get into an argument about Platonic versus other kinds of modes, but I am an anti-Platonist, let me put it simply, and I'll put my cards on the table. I don't believe that the world is elsewhere. I believe it's here and now. It's bad. It's also sometimes good. But in any case, things that are objective are grounding in terms of thinking about the rest of the world. And things that are objective and beautiful are grounding in terms of thinking about other things in the world which are either beautiful or ugly, or in other ways, a challenge to us in our composition of that world. And Bob's work serves that function. It's a very simple function in a way. The task is very simple. Doing it is extraordinarily difficult. And Bob would be the last person to say that that is what he is doing, because he is not kind of a missionary of his art. He's not trying to make a big statement. He's just making one, that's all. And at the same time, he is sufficiently aware of what the stakes are. So let me take another piece of the interview that I did with him, and I asked him basically at the end of the interview, well, what's this all about? What are you doing? He says, he's doing it for the experience of, and there was a pause, enlightening. An experience of delight, well-being, and rightness. It's like listening to music, like going to an opera and coming out of it and feeling somehow fulfilled, that what you experienced was extraordinary. It sustained you for a while. You can't explain it to someone who has not experienced it. Now, we're sitting in a room here where everybody's experienced Ryman's work. And we're going to hear today a lot of other explanations, and they will come from a variety of points of view. And as much as I've made a kind of polemic here, I am quite not averse to art history. I'm not against abstract thought about the history of art. I welcome all of that kind of stuff. I just don't think it comes first, and I don't even think it comes last. I think first and last is experience, and in the middle, you ask all those questions because the reason for asking them is often that they don't necessarily shed more light on the art. What they do is they clear away the cobwebs of ideologies that have obscured that art. Among them, the idea of the last painting. It was a lovely gambit that Ad Reinhardt threw out there, and then he proceeded to make, much like Bob, an awful lot of last paintings. Each one of them different. There is, however, a concerted effort on the part of a critical community to declare the end of painting, and with it, the end of art. And along the way to the end of painting, certain artists are picked as being exemplars of that process of exhaustion. And some of them are the assassins of art. Richter was once given this role. And the others are the saving last remnants of art. And Bob was given that role. So that it was thought that what Richter was doing, by a number of critics, was taking all of the different conventions of art and doing them in a cynical, destructive way so as to show you that there was nothing to them anymore. There may have been once upon a time, but there wasn't anymore. So if, for example, Richter painted a Titian painting of the Annunciation, the assumption was that he was showing you that this is now a category of art which is null and void forever. I'll get back to Richter in a second. Ryman was thought to be the person who had somehow slipped under the historical wire. He was still doing what was impossible to do, and because he was so good at it and such a good guy, he was allowed to do it until he ran out. But no one ever else would be able to pick that up again. That was done. End of story, end of polemic, end of everything. Now, why should this be the case? What is it in the deterministic histories of art that says this should be the case? Why is it particularly when neither of the artists involved believe it's the case for them? So when Gerhardt makes a painting of the Annunciation after Titian, and it disintegrates over the series of 5 paintings, he is not saying this is no longer possible categorically. It is saying it was not possible for me now. You paint the paintings you can paint when you can paint them, and when you can't paint them anymore, you stop. And it's worth running the experience through to see if you can paint that painting. He sincerely wanted to paint a Titian, but couldn't. He sincerely wanted to paint a Vermeer and could. And there are paintings of his that are equal of Vermeer. He only did one of them because he didn't need to do several times. He was a critic of beauty in his own way. And he made a series of pictures of his wife and child, which he then scored and flayed. The reason being that they were too pretty and not truly beautiful. And he said something to the effect of how beauty needs to be wounded for it to be trustable. And so he wounded an image of his own family and child. Now, Gerhardt is an interesting character because Bob and Gerhardt knew about each other for a long time. This book from which these interviews come has, it's Helmut Federle, Bryce Marden, Bob Mangle, Robert Ryman, and Gerhard Richter. And these was from the 1980s. And it's interesting because Bob was never very keen on Gerhardt. And kind of thought he was, more Dada than not, and was not really a painter, but was kind of a trickster, gamester, and so on and so forth. And was mistrustful of what this artist was doing. But it's interesting what happens when people really meet each other, when they really immerse themselves in each other's work. It was the custom at the Modern to invite to dinner parties at openings all the artists who had recently had retrospectives. So that when Gerhardt had his show, which I also did, I invited Bob to the show. I didn't know if he'd come or not because I knew that he had sort of mixed feelings. But he did. And he came and he looked at the whole show from start to finish while everybody else was having cocktails and schmoozing. And he came into the dining room as we were all to sit down. He said, he's really a painter. And he is, of course. But, for him to have gone through that experience and come to that conclusion after having been that skeptical was a huge move on his part. As I was organizing Gerhardt's show, I was in Germany, and I noticed that in Bonn there was a retrospective of Bob's work. And I had no idea what Gerhardt thought about him. I said, listen, could I take half the day off and go over to Bonn and see this exhibition before I miss my opportunity? And Gerhardt said, no, let's drive over there. He loves Ryman's work, loved it. And so we jumped into his BMW, and he drove like a bat out of hell to Bonn, and we went to see the show. And Gerhardt crawled the walls. He looked at every detail of every picture more carefully than you could imagine. There's this wonderful drawing that Guston made of Tom Hess looking at art. And Tom Hess's eyes, no, it's Meyer Shapiro, I think. Meyer Shapiro's head is up against the painting. There's this huge eyeball, like moving over the surface. Like it was kind of like trying to sort of decode the surface. Well, that was the way he looked at it. And he loved that work. Now, the dynamic is also interesting because, you know, Bob made paintings that were nominally all white. Gerhard made paintings that were gray. Gerhard did not make paintings that were black. And if you do think in ideological or symbolic terms about black and white, the polarities were there. They were there with Reinhardt, certainly, with other artists, and with Bob being the other side. And Gerhard basically took the position that one could not affirm absolutes under any circumstances. That to do so was to make a statement about the world, not just to choose a color. And so he made paintings in gray. He made paintings that made you queasy and uncertain all the time, right? But he wished he could make a Ryman painting. And his gray paintings are to Ryman as his Titian is to Titian. It's a meditation on what was not possible for him that was possible for an artist he admired, but in this case, it's an artist of his own time and roughly his own age. Now that also is interesting, because the discourse of painting in the 80s took account of none of this, or at least the mainstream discourse took account of none of this. First of all, painting was supposed to be dead, it just wouldn't lie down. And secondly, if it wasn't dead, it should sort of be tending in that direction. And artists were measured in terms of their seriousness as to whether they were furthering this dying swan routine, or, I don't know, Julius Caesar routine. In any case, here are two artists who are just doing it. And there are, of course, many, many, many artists who are just doing it who couldn't get the time of day from anybody because they were told what they were doing was an anachronism. Now, I will sort of stop now because I think I've pretty much used my time. But I would just put it to you that I could have given you an art historical lecture. I could have done a lot of things with this time, but I decided I'm reached the age where I don't particularly care to do that. I'm tired of arguing with people who don't argue back. I'm tired of people who argue with people who don't look before they argue, so that you can't even point to evidence and say, well, what about that? Because there is no evidence if your argument is meta something or other, right? In fact, the idea of evidence, the idea of facts is an offense to people who believe that it's all up on this abstract plane, right? It's all epistemic. It's not. It's down here. And Ryman's work is down here. Lots of it around us here. And even on this cover, it looks pretty good. I mean, this is about as good as a photograph gets, because you can really see the texture, okay? That is what he has spent his entire life doing. And just the other day, I saw a video, which was beautiful, of Bob working on a picture with Coltrane in the background, as engaged in the down here, here and now of painting as ever he was. And there are other artists out there who are involved in it. We just lost Ellsworth Kelly. But, enough.
Good afternoon. And thank you for coming, so numerous this afternoon. I'd like to thank Jessica Morgan for this invitation to speak today, and curator Courtney Martin for presenting such a seamless and really profoundly elegant installation of Robert Ryman's work in Chelsea at Dia. It's really allowed so many of us to spend time with a range of works within an optimal environment of natural light and unobstructed space, and it was such a delight for me to revisit the works upstairs as well. And I'd also like to extend the thanks to the Dia staff members, Stephen Hoban and Megan Whitco, for their kind assistance in preparing for today's talk. I should preface this paper by saying that I'm not as well acquainted with Ryman's work as many of you here are. And I cannot purport to advance the scholarship on an artist whose artistic practice has been thoroughly studied by others, including my fellow speakers today. And I'd, at that point, like to really extend a huge thanks to Robert's fantastic overture this morning. It's a hard act to follow. But I propose instead a careful observation of Ryman's work, which may lead our eye to places perhaps untapped on a computer screen or impossible to reproduce in books. It's an anatomy of sorts that I propose, of works that can be classified as either paintings or drawings, and an assessment of the unique distinction between these two principal forms in Ryman's art. We have the great fortune of being in proximity of works by Ryman both here and in Chelsea, so I hope these notes might prompt a return to looking, not the all too facile glimpsing at shifting images on the web that we're accustomed to today, but the kind of looking that requires our eyes to pause and our bodies to stand still. That is what Ryman's work asks of us. While the definition of painting has remained relatively stable and straightforward over time, drawing has long been a looser and more complex entity, both formally and conceptually. In Italian, the verb disegnare, to draw, appears in literature from the 14th century with different, though related, connotations. It's associated to planning or devising in the writings of Boccaccio and Petrarch, for instance. And it also refers to the physical act of drawing in the preparatory stages of a painting in the Practical Handbook for Artists by Cennino Cennini, for example. He was writing around the end of the 14th century. The 14th century and the beginning of the 15th century. Planning in the head or planning on paper were thus related. During the Renaissance, the term disegno acquired its intellectual association with invention, or the idea that precedes the production, which became, as we know, the Vasarian founding principle of the arts of painting, sculpture, and architecture. And I won't linger on here on Renaissance theory, which you're all, I'm sure, well aware of, but just as a reminder, Vasari associated the Central Italian artists with planning on paper, and referring to artists like Michelangelo and Raphael, and the Venetian artists like Titian were associated, for Vasari somewhat pejoratively, with color and direct expression. Interestingly, if I were to place Ryman in the past, I think I'd associate him more, perhaps rather bizarrely, to an artist like Caravaggio, a great colorist, in the sense that Caravaggio is known as not having planned his paintings. There is no evidence of any drawings. In fact, no drawings known by Caravaggio even survive. But an artist who had a direct expression on his canvases and planned and painted more or less at the same time. Thus, drawing and disegno remained the basis of academic education of the arts for centuries to come. The definition of drawing shifted in the 20th century as it began to incorporate new forms of finished works on paper, like the collage, for instance. And drawing was no longer just a means to an end, but an end in itself. As Cézanne stated, drawing and painting are no longer different factors. As one paints, one draws. The more harmony there is in the colors, the more precise the drawing becomes. And this is still Cézanne saying that when the color is at its richest, form is at its fullest. The traditional boundaries between media collapsed even further later on in the 20th century. Where does drawing begin, and where does drawing end and painting begin, asks Eva Hesse in 1970. And I don't know if my own drawings now aren't really paintings, except smaller and on paper. And she continues, the drawings could be called painting legitimately, and a lot of my sculpture could be called painting. Similarly, in an interview of 1976, Bryce Marden describes a group of works on paper as, and I quote from Bryce, finished drawings in themselves. And yet I tend to think of them more now as paintings, because technically they are paintings. The graphite being worked into the wax makes paint. So these are just like small panel paintings. The spectrum of drawing today, of course, is endless and can include any form of artistic expression that incorporates line in its composition, such as dance, and I think, for instance, of the works of Trisha Brown, digital animation, and more. So while acknowledging this overarching scope of linear form, I've had to limit my own definition of a drawing to a unique work on paper. But with Robert Ryman, this definition doesn't stand. In fact, he turns it completely upside down. This is not to say that he does not consider drawing independently of painting. He has indeed thought about drawing in its own right, but he questions its definition, challenges it, and advancing it, moving drawing to a different place, so to speak. The work you've been looking at up on the screen, for instance, to Gertrude Mellon of 1958, which is on display in the exhibition in Chelsea, is considered a painting on paper by Ryman and not a drawing. He used casein paint, a fast-drying, water-soluble medium used since Egyptian times and popular among commercial illustrators in the 1960s, together with graphite and colored pencil on beige wallpaper. And I think the artist would be horrified, but I've decided to slice up some of his paintings just to show you the details. I'm doing the opposite of what was done this morning, I'm afraid. Yes, it's also just so that you can notice the impasto of paint over pencil lines and appreciate, although you can't see them very well here, but the wallpaper has these very fine striations in it. The work was first exhibited at a MoMA staff exhibition in 1958 while Ryman was employed as a guard at the museum. Gertrude Mellon, incidentally, paid $70 at the time for this work, and the artist later bought it back and retitled it after her. For a stretched drawing, visible upstairs, of 1963, which is in charcoal on unprimed stretch cotton canvas stapled to wood, is considered a drawing, as the title itself purports. A distinction is made between the definition of form through color and medium in painting and composition through line in drawing. And I'll quote from the artist here, "When I draw, I'm usually thinking about line and what kind of line it can be," he admits. Really, that's how I look at drawings. It's more involved than that too. As with any painting, you do have surface to put the line on. What is that? How's the light going to work on it? So the approach is very similar to painting, but the focus is on line. The support is not the defining factor, as a drawing by Ryman can, in fact, like this one, be stretched. For this work, he drew a grid on stretched canvas, then unstretched it to reposition the grid over and around a stretcher. For the Gertrude Mellon painting you viewed before, Ryman floated the paper within a self-made frame, while this piece is supported solely by the wooden base of the stretcher. The sparseness of this display and its connection to the wall intentionally reveals the dimensional quality of the drawing as the lines of the grid wrap across the sides of the piece. And I'm afraid I'm going to show you another terrible slide, but I think it's important to not have just frontal views of the work and show the sides of it. The distinction between line and color and drawing and painting in Ryman's work is complex. It's a sophisticated one. It prompts a parallel with the classical notions of disegno and colore. The Renaissance dichotomy places disegno with pencil, lines, the representation of edges and perspective, against colore with brush, tones, and the modulated representation of surfaces. On the one hand, Ryman adheres to this dichotomy as line and graphic expression are paramount in his artistic practice and distinct from the spontaneous and fluent application of color through medium. But his work also bridges the two by placing line and color on the same pedestal, so to speak. one does not lead to the other, nor does it exclude the other. When asked about the relevance of drawing to the final execution of his work in an interview of 1994, Ryman admits, "No, I don't use drawing. I never use drawing as a sketch for a painting. My drawings are as drawings for themselves, not sketches for paintings. However, I will do little drawings for fasteners because I have to have the fasteners fabricated." And here again is a terrible slide but important to just understand what he's talking about. Here's another one, actually. These are the only types of sketches Ryman admits to have made. When fasteners became integral fixtures in his work in the mid-1970s, he didn't use what was available to him commercially, but designed them to comply specifically to each individual piece, and ordered them from a manufacturer in Brooklyn. "I do drawings for the fasteners," he reiterated, "sometimes relating them to the actual surfaces that I'll be working on so I can understand the scale, but I don't do drawings as you would if you were doing a picture for a painting." In his seminal catalogue for the 1993 Tate MoMA retrospective that we saw this morning, Robert Storr mentions the preparatory studies that, when made, which is seldom, are usually the same size as the final version of the piece and are not preserved after they have served their purpose. So even if he might have made such drawings, he consciously left no evidence of such a practice. While Ryman himself is very clear about the distinction between drawing and painting in his work, it can easily be lost in the realm of museum departments and the categorization of artists and objects that we're so fond of today. When I asked to see all the drawings in the collection at the Modern, I realized I used the wrong term because I was shown only the works on paper and not this work that was in fact made for a drawings exhibition, but that now, interestingly, resides in the painting and sculpture department and is stored off-site in Queens. Ryman's conception of drawing further evolved in 1976, when Bernice Rose invited him to participate in Drawing Now, her groundbreaking exhibition on the new autonomous approaches to drawing of the period. He presented this untitled work, one of 4 drawings by him in the show, in pastel and graphite pencil on plexiglass, bolted to the wall with steel plates. Curator and artist had not discussed support in their meetings prior to the exhibition, but Bernice remembers showing him the wall on which his works were going to be displayed and giving him the dimensions of it. These were vital factors in the making of his work, as the drawing incorporated not only its own scale, but also its relationship to the space around it. And I have an installation shot of the Drawing Now exhibition of 1976. According to Bernice, Ryman had sought ways to connect drawing directly to the wall without the obstruction of a frame or a stretcher. While a drawing on paper usually requires a frame to hang on the wall, his use of plexiglass allowed him to relate the drawing to the wall more seamlessly. In discussing his work in a later interview with Gary Garrels in relation to work done here at DIA, Ryman reasons on the superfluous elements that can alter a drawing or a painting. And I'll quote from him again. He says that something that is put on it, he says, an edge, some kind of a frame, if it's put on a separate panel by itself, or if it's covered with plexiglass or glass, all those things can completely destroy it. And just as a side point, I saw a drawing at the Modern the other day that was gifted by Win Kramarski. A beautiful drawing was gifted to the museum, and it was in a mat. It had been matted, and the mat looked completely incongruous with the work, which was obviously not conceived to have a mat around it. But what is exactly that? What is it exactly that makes this work a drawing? To me, it's the rawness and pulpability of its material, and the sense that it still feels like a work in the making, even though it is perfectly balanced and thoughtfully fabricated. Pastel is an intrinsically powdery and fleeting medium, and a close look at the surface of this piece reveals how he sandblasted the plexiglass to give it tooth and for the pastel to adhere to it. As he describes himself, the pastel would work right in, like on paper. There's also the inherent graphic quality of the edges of the work and the cubic forms of its fasteners that ally this piece to the graphic field. Works like this example at MoMA, the one on the screen from the Surface Veil series of 1970, sit more ambiguously within the drawing painting sphere. The seemingly haphazard use of masking tape to attach it to the wall gives it the volatility of a sketch, while its thick impasto of oil on fiberglass anchors it spatially within the realm of painting. The work is literally a layering of transparency and opacity, with the most fragile and translucent material, the wax paper, on the bottom. The wax paper frame that backs and supports the piece enhances its featherweight quality and visually floats the sheet from the wall. Although the title Surface Veil reflects the ethereal quality of the work, it relates, like many of Ryman's titles, to the material itself that it was made in, and in this case, to the type of fiberglass he painted on. Another chopping of Ryman's work here, a detail of Surface Veil. Here, the oil paint grips onto the crisp texture of the fiberglass, a material as luminescent as paper and canvas, but grittier and more sturdy. Other artists of Ryman's generation experimented with the malleability of fiberglass, such as Robert Morris in his series of rubbings of around 1972, and this is a rubbing of a Leonardo da Vinci book, which was made in graphite on fiberglass. And Eva Hesse had also used it in some of her smaller sculptures known as studio works in 1968. Unfortunately, the technical challenge of having to glue the tape to the wall has prevented MoMA from exhibiting Surface Veil since 2007. And this is what it looks like now in the prints and drawings room at the Modern. Here, it is in its dormant state, so to speak, stored in a box against an acid-free board. You can see, though, where the adhesive applied to the back of the masking tape has stained the supporting board. You can just see it on the edges of the tape there. Even here, however, the overlapping sheets of wax paper, what's seen here in the detail, you can see the overlapping of those sheets of wax paper, reflect the creative process of an artist who works his way through discordancy to a place where line, color, and dimensions are bound and balanced. And this is another work where the distinction between drawing and painting is blurred. Arista of 1968 on display at Dia in Chelsea too. Unstretched linen, painted fully in grey oil, is stapled to the wall and outlined along its edges with blue chalk lines. And again, I have to show you details of this just so that you know what I'm talking about. The spectrum of color in Ryman's paintings and drawings is achieved largely by the modulation of light on its surfaces. Both the surface itself and the application of medium generate the moving interplay and flicker of light and shadow in the work. Paper, in particular, looms large in the oeuvre of Robert Ryman. In fact, much of his work of the 1950s and early 1960s is on paper, like this untitled painting on paper of 1959 on view at Dia. Paper was cheap and easily available, certainly, but it also has intrinsic qualities that allow Ryman to capture light in different ways according to the paper's range of thicknesses, sheens, tones, coarseness, silkiness, etc. The lightness of paper, in terms both of its weight and its luminescence, lifts the painting and likens it more to a drawing. The Classico series of paintings on paper that Ryman exhibited at the Conrad Fischer Gallery in Düsseldorf in 1968 exemplify the kind of glow he sought in the materials, in this case, acrylic or polymer paint on sheets of handmade Fabriano paper, the eponymous Classico brand. I experimented with 4 different weights of paper and colors, he explains. I liked the thinness, and I liked the way the standard panels sat on the wall very softly. They were heavy and hard, but they didn't look that way. And you can just see in this detail how they seemingly float on the wall. They're actually attached to smaller sheets of featherboard at the back of them, so that the featherboard itself is glued to the wall. The nuances of color expand as the Classico series varies in tonality and form. Classico 5 at the Modern is composed of 12 sheets, and the unmarked areas of paper shed a warmer light where the cream-colored paper is left unmarked around the edge of the grid, but also in the exposed areas where the tape that attached them to the wall when he painted them was applied. And there's a detail so that you get a sense of the reflective trait of the Classico series was achieved by adding varnish to the paint, because I wanted the light to bounce, he adds. A play of light occurs between the absorption of the paper and the brilliancy of the paint, as medium is channeled through positive and negative space. Here's another detail. Despite the fact that Conrad Fischer notoriously tried to minimize the import duties on the Classico series by classifying them as used paper, Ryman unquestionably considered them paintings. Yet here too, disegno and colore are conjoined as the edges of the sheets themselves and of the painted areas form a series of grids. Ryman recalls you had the horizontal and vertical lines where the papers joined, though of course in the actual painting there were no straight lines. And in another interview he admits that, in fact, I almost never paint a line. I mean, all of my lines are planes meeting. The ruffled edges of the sheets and the paper fabricator stamps are all crucial considerations in work that bears evidence of the author's handling and what could be described as a unique form of painterly draftsmanship. One of the great advantages of studying drawings is the opportunity to see the works in the nude, so to speak, laid out on a table within the confines of a study room. Of course, in the case of Ryman, this is somewhat of a sacrilege, since the works are far from their intended modes of presentation. They're limp without their connection to the wall, so this more private viewing environment is more of an operating room when it comes to his work, or somewhat of a transitional space. On the other hand, my visit to MoMA's study room introduced me to aspects of his artistic practice that might be masked in public display. It further exposed the mindful creative process behind each work. In the case of this untitled work of 1965, for instance, a gift by Ryman to the museum, even just the label on its box revealed the depth and detail of Ryman's experience with materials. The material itself is simply noted as enamel on Bristol board, but he follows this with an exact description of the technique, and I'll quote from the label, his own studio label on it. 9 horizontal white strokes, some overlapping, are thin at the center and become more dense at the edges. The paint is thicker at the start and end of each stroke. I was also struck by the custom-made crate itself, which was evidently designed by the artist to protect it from mishandling or incorrect packing. But it's so beautifully and carefully constructed, it could be an integral part of the work of art itself. It's almost like a tailor-made home for it. As a side view of it shows the work attached to 2 sheets of styrofoam and hinged to the wooden base from behind with 2 screws attached to it at either side. The white edges of the work are exposed, similar to stretch drawing we viewed earlier. Both are dimensional objects, but while one delineates space graphically, the other renders it tonally. Here, the tan board acts as a tonal background for Ryman's parallel strokes of warm white paint. Its smooth and slippery surface has no grasp for the brush to catch on, but the striations formed by the hair of the brush appear through glazes of pure liquid pigment. You can appreciate that more in this detail. And here is the top of the crate that I was mentioning before. While color is rendered by support and handling of material in Ryman's oeuvre, his most calligraphic expression of line is found in the recurring signature and initials in his work. The R on the screen was one of several pieces he submitted for the catalogue of a subsequent exhibition on drawings curated by Bernice at the Modern in 1985, entitled New Work on Paper 3. These drawings were in fact not on paper, but on an anodized aluminum plate, square in format, to be hung 1/2 inch from the surface of the wall at a height of 60 inches to the center, to be perfectly precise. Spectrum 2 on the screen here was drawn in ink on aluminum and designed specifically for display in the exhibition catalogue rather than in the exhibition itself. Ryman's use of the signature, this was a catalogue that Bernice, for which Bernice asked artists to make work specifically for the catalogue, different from the works in the actual display in the exhibition. Ryman's use of the signature as subject was a conscious evocation of line as opposed to a conscious portrayal of self. I'll quote from him again, saying that, "Very early, I began using the signature in my painting as line," he says, "simply because I didn't use line so much in my paintings, and I felt that the signature had been a traditional device that painters used, and so I would turn the signature on the side and use it as line." He adds that he turned the signature to the side to make it more abstract, because I wasn't so interested in my name, I was more interested in the line of the letters and how they would work compositionally with the painting, placed depending on where I felt the line could add movement. Here's another example of the work in the catalogue using his signature laid down on its side. Here is another one. These curvilinear delineations, this one doesn't have the signature, but it's a very similar type of line in it, are particularly reminiscent of the confident hand and fluent contours of Matisse, whose work surely informed Ryman's unique conception of drawing. And this is an installation shot of that exhibition. Interestingly, on a side note, the work Accord, the oil on aluminum piece that you can see on the left side there on the corner, is also on view at Dia in Chelsea at the moment. And this is another installation shot of that same exhibition with Accord on the right. Catalyst 3 in enamel on aluminum and on view in the Dia Chelsea installation appeared instead in the actual works on paper exhibition and not in the catalogue, which is probably a good thing. As you can see, it's completely unreproducible. It was described by Ryman in 1993 as probably his favorite drawing, which expands his definition of drawing even beyond the parameters discussed in this paper, and I'm happy that this will somewhat lead into our next paper with Courtney. No one expounds the underlying intricacy of Ryman's work and its interrelationships of medium and material, light and shadow, line and form, stillness and movement better than the artist himself. It's just one of those things that is so seemingly simple, he says of Catalyst 3, but it's very complex and everything works. What you're not seeing in the photograph is this line, and he's referring here to the aluminum edge of the drawing. It's just the line of the metal, but it's there, and it's important. In Cennino Cennini's chapter on the fundamental provisions for anyone who enters the artistic profession, the 15th century author professes that, and I'll quote from the book, "You who with lofty spirit are fired with this ambition and are about to enter the profession, begin by decking yourselves with this attire: enthusiasm, reverence, obedience, and constancy." These are the traits that would have made Ryman an optimal Renaissance master and that tie him to the thoroughness and timelessness that are conveyed in his work today. Thank you.
This is great. It's just like being back in the classroom where I can't see you, so I don't know what's happening out there. So I want to start by giving thanks to Sandra Amon, Claire Dilworth, Elizabeth Estabrook, David Gray, and Naomi Spector for their assistance in preparing this paper. When I began thinking about how the Ryman exhibition for Dia Chelsea might take shape, I returned to my notes on and memories of exhibitions of his paintings to think through what I knew about his practice and what I might add to this exhibition history. Realistically, I was thinking about the 1993 show. In preparation for the show, I was excited to see so many more of his paintings, as much as I was challenged to think about organizing them in a manner that explained the aesthetic richness that he presents to us all. The second gallery exactly replicates how I ingested the work over the course of last year. There were the works that demonstrated Ryman's understanding of the relationship between the painting and the wall by way of fasteners, hard wire, and sure-handed determination. In other works, Ryman's sincere and long-term experimentation with the interaction of light and color on the canvas is front and center. These works are adjacent to others that demonstrate a material curiosity and willingness to experiment in the field of metals. Here, for example, is the wall that makes plain the profoundly frustrating and fulfilling conversations that many painters have with the edges of their compositions. The paintings that I selected for the north or back wall of the larger gallery combine some aspects of all of the best attributes of the other works. From the outset of organizing the show, I was struck by their formal complexity, cool surfaces, and multiple engagements with space. All completed within a few years of each other in the 1980s and with a limited range of tools and materials, yet they do not actually form a series or a named group like many others in his practice do. Taken together or examined one by one, these works have led me to pose larger questions about the state of the three-dimensional object in Ryman's painting practice. And I just want to point out that my overly didactic little graph that you see here is actually just to show you that they are numbers 7, 8, and 9 on the back wall, in case you're going back to see the show this afternoon. Despite the seemingly two-dimensionality of most of his paintings, as early as the mid-1960s, curators, critics, and viewers were aware of the possibility of the object within his output. Perhaps the most obvious example of this is the inclusion of Allied, seen here in Systemic Painting, curator Lawrence Alloway's final exhibition at the Guggenheim Museum. On view throughout the fall of 1966, the show featured 28 New York-based painters in an installation that encompassed almost the entirety of the museum. Ryman joined a list that included Ellsworth Kelly, Frank Stella, Ken Noland, and many others. Though each artist took a different approach to their work, most worked in large scale, utilized high-keyed color, and many employed various innovative methods, such as shaped canvases or enameling. Conceptually, Systemic embodied a loose layman's interpretation of systems theory, an interdisciplinary study of order developed in the hard sciences. Notable to critics and viewers, however, was the large number of paintings that were rendered in relief. I show you here an image of Allied next to an installation shot from the show, but unfortunately I do not have an installation shot showing the Ryman being installed. Though the show lacked a conclusive explanation of the relationship between systems theory and painting practices, the prevalence of objects that lived between the painting and sculpture binary was a feature that defined the show and best illustrated something about the systemic. Within this curatorial concept and installed in the museum's demonstrative architecture, Allied could be seen for its potential towards dimensionality. In fact, Alloway described this potential as matter painting, or a form that he placed halfway between painting and sculpture, not unlike Donald Judd's understanding of the specific object, save for the point of departure. Alloway started from the point of view of painting and Judd from sculpture. As objects, matter painting was decidedly abstract and devoted to occupying literal space rather than creating the illusion of space. While this may not have been a true reflection of Allied's actual physical characteristics, its presence in the exhibition makes the most sense as a meditation on what the space around a painting might add to the composition just at the moment at which Ryman claimed literal space as a constituent of his compositions. In the early 1970s, Ryman began experimenting with wooden supports. These experimentations were concurrent with others in metals and plastics that he undertook in the same decade. Perhaps it was the aftermath of the space race and the prevalence of new materials that the aeronautics and space industries released into the open market that supported his natural curiosity about ground. Or, as other writings suggest, the wooden support was simply a problem to be solved. Whatever the occasion or the prompt, Ryman began using pre-made wooden doors as supports. These structures are hollow, thinly constructed, and relatively lightweight. Varese is one such structure. Installed in the first year that Dia Beacon opened in 2003, Varese actually dates from 1975. By definition, a wall is a continuous vertical structure that defines an area. The scale of a wall often notates its purpose as one of enclosure, shelter, architecture, or decoration, though any one of these attributes could be combined for multiple purposes. Despite the suggestion of the title, Varese wall is not a single structure, nor is it load-bearing, save for the layers of paint that have been applied to it. The painting is actually made of 6 wood door panels held together by 6 corresponding metal rods, the entirety of which is painted and sits over 5 blue foam blocks of the type often used to protect objects from another surface, like that of a painting in process resting on a studio floor. Each time the Varese wall is installed, it must be fully repainted. Measuring 8 feet high and 24 feet long, it is objectively large, and for Ryman's practice, one of the largest works completed to date. As you can see in the image, Varese does not rest on the wall. It is braced to stand just over 1.5 feet away from it. And its relationship to the wall creates a kind of negative space of just enough width that it can neither be transgressed by a human body nor completely ignored. This space is, I think, as close as Ryman gets to an aggressive gesture or a directive. '75, the year that Varese was completed, was an important one for Ryman. He had a well-received solo show at the Kunsthalle in Basel, and he began experimenting with the fasteners and fittings that would officially make their appearance in paintings in the following year. Here I show you one example of an early work in which fasteners are to be taken as a part of the whole, rather than an addition. Their presence indicates that we need to look at the wall around the work to see the sides, front, top, and bottom, without the limitation of the edge of the canvas. Perhaps we might then look to Varese as a kind of prototype for those works because of its physical projection away from the wall and the visible supports on both its back sides and bottom edge. The work's evocative title has a seemingly straightforward provenance. Varese was commissioned by Italian art patron Giuseppe Panza di Buomo for inclusion in his museum-scaled estate in Varese, Italy. In the interview with curator Gary Garrels that accompanied Ryman's 1988 exhibition at Dia on 22nd Street, he describes the sculptural feel of Varese as an incident of its process rather than its intent. He intended, as he explained to Garrels, to make a room in Panza's villa that could allow for the changeable conditions of the northwestern Lombardy region that resulted in the villa's damp walls. He continues with the following, quote, "I was trying to devise a way to line the walls with metal foil because I wanted to paint on wooden veneer panels. I was working on a way to join them together so that they would line the room on 3 walls. Behind them would be the metal foil to keep the moisture off of the wood," end quote. His very practical solution to the very real problem presented by the space was met by a desire to see the piece away from the wall, to see it sit on the floor, to be able to see its surface, front and back. He wanted it to be, quote, "totally naked," a phrase that I think invites the transparency of the painting's relationship to the space that it inhabits. Here, we might substitute his word naked for literal, or more appropriately, anti-illusionistic. In this and other interviews, Ryman has recounted viewing Panza's estate and its surrounding area, where he perhaps encountered the high walls that lined both sides of the hilly road leading away from the city of Varese and up to the Villa Panza. Varese, of course, is the site of the Sacro Monte di Varese, or the Sacred Mountain of Varese, the well-worn mountaintop pilgrimage site that charts the mystery of Christ's life. The holy road that leads to this site is also lined on both sides by a wall. Before you think I've gone off the rails here, I point out that this occurrence, not to suggest a one-to-one match of the Varese wall's extended surface based on either account or location. Rather, I use these examples to point to what I think is at stake in constituting a painting as an immovable object. How might we encounter this work not as sculpture or architecture, but as material permanence? How might we construe the significant material renewal required to destabilize that permanence? Though I situated this idea within the context of the three-dimensional, I am now challenged to pay attention to the properties of fixity, duration, and stability as functions of painting. Lucio Fontana's concept of spatialismo, or spatialism, might be useful in this process. First promoted in his Manifesto Blanco of 1946, spatialism was his attempt as a painter to transcend the confines of the two-dimensional plane. In his first manifesto, Fontana announced his goal for a spatialist art, one that could engage technology to achieve an expression of the fourth dimension in a radical and new aesthetic idiom that melded the categories of architecture, sculpture, and painting. Fontana's concept might be a constructive way to consider how Varese functions as an architectonic painting, all the while maintaining its medium specificity. The scale, the active reapplication of paint required to install, and the place name title suggest that Ryman's commission for Panza might have been intended as a site-specific work and/or a long-term display for the villa, like the others that remain on site there, such as those by his contemporaries, Robert Irwin, James Turrell, or Dan Flavin, for which you see his permanent installation here at the Villa Panza. All of their works were acquired and installed between 1973 and 1976, like Varese. His work, however, was constructed in his studio, where it was propped up by the blue foam as he worked on it. This studio adjustment gave him the idea to display it in this way. Though commissioned for Panza, it never went to the villa. When it was shown at the John Weber Gallery in November of 1975, Ryman retained the foam blocks partly because they had, through the course of its production, become inseparable from any other aspect of the composition. Or, in his words, quote, "I became so used to these foam blocks that they became a part of the painting. I just couldn't see it any other way," end quote. Within their compositional function, there was also practicality. In the same passage, he notes that the floor of the Weber Gallery's space at 420 West Broadway was uneven. So the foam blocks double back to their original function as a way to stabilize the large painting. In addition to serving as a kind of beta model for the later works with fasteners, the Varese wall is also an antecedent for the group of three-dimensional paintings that Ryman completed in the 1980s, like those seen here. Without name or designation as a series, these paintings have a specific place within the practice. In the early 1980s, Ryman began working with Josh Bugayer, a stretcher maker and fabricator in Brooklyn, who had previously made other stretchers and supports for him. With Bugayer, he developed an aluminum or fiberglass honeycomb lattice structure that would form the interiors of the supports. Paint could then be applied to them. This structure was both a replacement for and improvement on the thin, hollow panels used for the Varese wall. Here, excuse me, I show you an example, but not actually the correct one, of what the honeycombed interior looks like next to an example of the type of hollow panel used for the Varese wall. Lightweight and more resilient and durable, these new supports could be formed in ways that matched Ryman's thinking about surface and ground. but they did not need to be repainted each time they were shown, nor did they completely require metal rods for stability. To my knowledge, there are only 7 of these paintings, and of those 7, only 3 are at substantial relief to be described as fully three-dimensional. These are pace, factor, and pair navigation. The three-dimensional paintings were first shown from February to March of 1984 at the New York outpost of what was then Galerie Maître Lalonde, now the Lalonde Gallery. This space was a temporary office on 57th Street that was used before the new gallery would open at 9 West 57th. Both were established as a way to serve or mind the French gallery's American artists, such as Edward Kienholz, Jim Dine, and Ryman. This exhibition of 3 works was a kind of preview for the larger show in Paris that opened later in the spring of 1984 and featured all 7 of the group. In the New York display, factor and pace dominated the small area, giving way to a sense that these works were overtly monumental, a physical departure from the Ryman known for his smaller, painterly white squares. The fabricated works are a result of his investigations into the decade prior into radical modes of painting and presentation. Take pace, for example. The painting is a small square placed horizontally. From this position, its face, as it were, is positioned for the viewer to look onto it from above. From a slight distance, the narrow band of red wood indicates what would normally be called the edge of the canvas, suggesting that this is a painting on a solid wood panel. But it's not. Instead, it is a fiberglass construction painted over a reflected white enamel. The small wall fasteners hold the work in place, while the long, thin aluminum legs make a show of the verticality of the painting. It would be easy to describe this work as sculpture, and perhaps even easier to categorize it as minimalist. It is fabricated, composed of new materials, and streamlined in a manner that supports a generalized understanding of that period of artists and their objects. But pace and factor and pair navigation beside it were conceived, composed, and displayed in the 1980s, well after the origins of minimalism would have allowed them to exist without acknowledging its discourse. Let me be clear. I do not think that Ryman is trying to make minimal objects, or that he is periodizing his own output. Rather, I think that he knew full well what criticisms would be lobbed at him for this work and how this work would be received. Why else would someone so sure of his materials and their functions make objects that obscured their own construction? Why else would he knowingly place these objects at heights that allude to a familiar strain of domesticity, if not also design? Why play with late modernism if you already know how the game will end? While I do not have the answer to the big questions that I'm posing here, I'm planning on setting that project for myself over the next few months to figure out where this might lead. I am, however, certain that what is happening with these paintings is strategic. There is a way in which one cannot look at these works and not take seriously the innovation of contemporary painting. These paintings force us to look above and below, while looking from above, below, and around. They demand a viewership that is engaged, somewhere between spectator and participant. In each, the canvas has become a plane that is a total field. I'm borrowing this concept of field from Pierre Bourdieu's use of the term field, wherein a field, like art, is constituted by the set of ever-shifting conditions that determine its corpus at any one time. In Ryman's three-dimensional paintings, our field starts with the painted plane and extends out into the rest of his practice, to see the painting as a realm of potential meaning that cannot be reduced into parts. Thank you.
I'm James Meyer, and I wanted to congratulate Courtney, Martin, and Megan Whitko on the beautiful show in Chelsea. And I want to also thank Megan and Stephen Hoban for organizing this event, and also to thank Francesca Logalbo and David Gray, who helped me with pictures for this talk. I am also going to speak extemporaneously. But unlike Rob, my friend Rob, I am going to speak in an art historical manner. And I wanted to think particularly about Ryman and minimalism and post-minimalism and these sorts of debates of the 60s and beyond, and his position in this. Painting was always, it seems to me, at the center of minimal discourse and always at the margin. The discussion centered initially around sculpture on objects. And the most famous essays on minimalism are writings that you all know by Donald Judd and Robert Morris and Michael Fried's Art and Objecthood. They're all discussions around the status of the object, the sculpture, and so on. But painting, it would seem to me, was always lurking underneath these debates. It was something that was to be surpassed, if you are Donald Judd and Dan Flavin, or something to suppress, and that, I think, is the case with Judd. It seems to me the two most salient painters that we might associate with minimalism would be Robert Ryman and Frank Stella. I'm not saying that's not a judgment of quality versus Mangold or Martin or Joubert or Martin, but it is to say that the discussion really has concentrated around those two particular figures, and it concentrated around them at particular moments in the debates. So there's a historicity to these debates and a historicity of their reception. And of course, Stella I'm going to talk about Stella as well, is, if you will, the fox of minimalist painting. He emerges very quickly. And Ryman is the hedgehog, and I use the famous analogy of Isaiah Berlin rather loosely. But it's interesting to think of these two painters, these two careers together, and I do so, of course, because of the show that just occurred at the Whitney and the show of Courtney's at Dia, and to think about those two shows. And I want to sort of explore their very distinct itineraries, their passages through this discussion. So here are the two kind of minimalist shows of the mid-60s. One hand on the left is Primary Structures, Jewish Museum, April of '66. You see Dia's corner piece by Dan Flavin in the back. You can see it down the hall. At the Jewish Museum, curated by Kinniston McShine. And on the other hand, Lawrence Alloway's Systemic Painting at the Guggenheim, which was that fall, and which Courtney has discussed. And both were attempts to kind of think about the status of a kind of morphological reduction in this moment in the 60s. But Primary Structures had a lot more legs. It really is still very much discussed. We just had a reconstruction of it at the Jewish Museum, in a sense, last year. Systemic painting has kind of fallen by the wayside, so it's wonderful that Courtney has brought it up today. And of course, Primary Structures was really all kinds of stuff. It wasn't just Judd and Flavin and Andre and Lewitt and Larry Bell. It was all kinds of artists, British artists, other kinds of American sculptors. It was very polyglot. But the artists who emerge from that exhibition as the most salient are the people we now call the minimalists. Systemic painting was a bit more, as Courtney suggested, it was concerned at this point with the shaped canvas. And you see a stela, a regular polygon on the right. I think that might be a Neil Williams on the left. Somebody might correct me. And it was very brightly colored. As Courtney's suggesting, Alloway is making this argument for a kind of material painting, a painting that is physical, that's relief-like, that can hold its own in a time when there is a demand for a kind of actuality in art. Judd's demand for an art that is quote-unquote real. And of course, for Judd, that would mean a three-dimensional object. And Alloway is making the case, well, actually, painting can also be actual and material. It's interesting to think about the painting that Courtney showed by Ryman, and what was the status of Ryman's work in this show of brightly colored, shaped canvases, relief-like images, a white painting in this show. I haven't consulted the criticism lately, but I don't think it generated much response. And in a sense, it's kind of there, but really this is a show, in a sense, about the triumph of a kind of stela, it seems to me, and a shaped canvas polychromatic form. So Stella does emerge first. He emerges, as you all know, at the age of 23 at the 16 American show at the Museum of Modern Art, curated by Dorothy Miller, the black paintings. And at that moment, in the catalog of that show, Carl Andre writes Preface to Stripe Painting, which I've reproduced here. For me, the most important of all minimal text is this text written by Carl Andre about the black paintings, in which he says, art excludes the unnecessary. Frank Stella has found it necessary to paint stripes. There is nothing else in his painting. So there's this idea, first of all, of negation or purgation. It's about getting rid of everything that doesn't need to be there. Frank Stella is not interested in expression or sensitivity. He's interested in the necessities of painting. Expression and sensitivity, goodbye abstract expressionism, goodbye a kind of 10th Street, de Kooning-esque, expressive, late abstract expressionist painting. Symbols are counters passed among people. Stella's painting is not symbolic. So goodbye to the kind of highfalutin, grandiose symbolism of New York School painting in its kind of early iterations. His stripes are paths of brush onto canvas. These paths lead only into painting. There you're starting to see, it seems to me, something more than reduction, art excluding the unnecessary. You're starting to see, it seems to me, process. The process of painting is starting to come into this debate. The paths of brush that lead only into painting, the stripe unit with which Stella covers the canvas, is a kind of system for making a painting, of covering a painting. And it's the process of painting that sort of matters. So these are some of the tenets that Carl Andre puts out in 1959. And it seems to me very interesting to remember this text as we think about minimalist painting and minimalist sculpture. So, of course, Stella, emerges very quickly. He's already at Castelli, the most important gallery at that moment. The aluminum paintings introduce, of course, the notches, starting to introduce the shaped canvas, which you have in the copper paintings in '61. The notch V's, the running V's. And it's this painting which is most influential on the minimal object makers. Stella's work is so central to the discussion at this time because he's making these sorts of relief-like paintings that are coming out thick off the wall. The stretcher, as you all know, is generating the stripe module that gets reiterated on the support. Donald Judd would describe these paintings of Stella, the aluminum paintings, as slabs. For him, they're moving into objects. They're moving into the room. And of course, Judd in 1962 is starting to make his reliefs that will ultimately lead to a three-dimensional art. As you see in his first show at the Green Gallery in '63, Stella is also, of course, terribly influential on Carl Andre, and Carl Andre's early sculpture, the pyramids, are very much readings of the stripe system of Stella's black paintings and aluminum paintings. So Stella's very influential, as you can see, on the minimal object makers. And of course, he would repudiate them. He would say that their work is a bad reading of painting, and that he is a painter. He adamantly would insist that he's a painter. And of course, as soon as he sort of perfects that kind of monochromatic stripe system, he's starting to make the mitered corner paintings, the concentric squares. He's starting to introduce a serial coloristic system. He's starting to bring in illusionism and making it more of a painting and less of an object. And so, of course, it's the irregular polygons in '66 at Castelli that enunciate this movement away from an object-type art, a minimal-type reduction, toward a more polychromatic, shaped canvas, and frankly, composed arranging of the canvas that then is so evident in systemic painting. And systemic painting, as Courtney suggested, was this idea of a kind of systematic art, and the stripe paintings of Stella had a kind of systematicity, as you know, that he would make up all the drawings in advance and then execute them afterwards. There was a kind of systematicity to the series. But they are introducing these irregular polygons, a compositional balancing, a kind of non-systematicity, a traditional compositional balancing act that moves away from the systemic. '67, the protractor paintings, the Polish village paintings of the '70s, all of these very extravagant reliefs of the '80s, metallic, and so on, and '90s. And so here we are at the Whitney show that just closed, and that show was this attempt to suggest that there was a coherence to Stella's project, that somehow that concentric square painting of the '60s somehow relates to this very grandiose relief on the right. Somehow the irregular polygons in the back set up the kind of illusionism and spatial play moving back into real space, but illusionistically, of the works on either side of the room. So now, Courtney's show. And I think it's rather interesting that they emerged contemporaneously. And how do we think about Stella's work within this kind of minimal frame? If Stella is the arch-minimalist painter as a young person, it's Ryman who emerges, if you will, as the arch-minimalist painter later on. And I want to think about his work in respect to this debate, these discussions. In the book I wrote on minimalism, I claim that for me, there were two meanings of the minimal historically. One was a kind of morphological reduction, basically what Carl Andre is saying. Art excludes the unnecessary, an art of purgation, reduction, simplification. We all know, of course, as Rob and others have described, that Ryman's art is anything but minimal and reduced and all of that. There's great nuance, great difference. But it could be seen and came to be seen as the kind of exemplary minimal image of this idea of minimalist negation, of getting rid of the unnecessary. The second meaning of the minimal, if the first is the morphological reduction, the other is this idea of fabrication, the idea that the artist didn't make the work, quote unquote, that people like Dan Flavin and Carl Andre were using ready-made materials to make their works. People like Donald Judd were making drawings that other people would execute. And by the way, that's in complete attack on disegno in the traditional sense, which, as you beautifully described, was a kind of in Cianini, this idea of the idea then must be fulfilled through the artist's making, through the hand. That disegno, as you suggested, includes making. And it's precisely that which an artist like Judd dissects. He comes up with the plan, and then other people make it. So this was very controversial in the 60s, this idea of the minimal, that the artist had not made the work, and therefore it wasn't really art if the artist hadn't made it, this traditional idea of making, which goes back to the Renaissance and continues through the 60s with the art of de Souvero and Caro and others, that they made their stuff, and Andre and Judd and Flavin didn't make it. So those are the two sort of polarities, or the two themes in the minimal, the morphological reduction and the reduction in making, if you will, to the point where the work of art barely seemed to be art because of these factors. So let's think about Ryman in respect to these questions. Let's think about his reception in the late 50s in these paintings. And some of which are in the exhibition in Chelsea that we just saw. And how long it takes for Ryman's art to be seen, how long it takes for him to enter the debate. Rob made the point that he's not his own propagandist, used another word, but he doesn't toot his own horn. He's not writing essays about his work like Robert Morris and Judd. He's not entering the polemics in the same way. He's making the work. And all these works, just imagine, all these wonderful works are just being made and not being exhibited and discussed. He enters, it seems to me, one place of entry is in this show called 11 Artists at a funny gallery called Kmar Gallery downtown. There were two dancers called K and Mar, and they just put their names together, and you get the Kmar Gallery. And Flavin, who was friends with Ryman from their days of guarding at the Museum of Modern Art, created this show in which you see a Stella Moroccan painting in the back. You see a couple of Lewitt, the tabletop piece right close to us, another Lewitt, a box hiding something. But this Ryman on the right was in that show. So it's a point where he's starting to be included, where the friendship with Flavin is starting to bring it into some kind of visibility. Apparently this painting doesn't exist anymore, just a part of it exists. The Windsor paintings, 65, 66, and now allied, the painting and systemic painting. So we're starting to come into visibility, but no real one-person show until the Bianchini show in 67. And then, of course, in Europe. And I think Rob made the good point that Ryman's work really gets appreciated and seen abroad, in a sense, almost before here. And on the one hand, Conrad Fischer's space in Dusseldorf, the Classicos that we saw in your talk that Panza buys, and on the other hand, Heiner Friedrich, the co-founder of Dia, hence Dia's commitment to Ryman goes way back in Munich. Now we're at Fischbach Gallery, where I believe Naomi Spector, who's here today, was working, and who's had a big effect on the reception of Ryman, it seems to me. And this fascinating show, Anti-Illusion, Process Materials, Whitney Museum, 1969, where you have Richard Serra's famous casting lead piece. You have an Eva Hess on the left, you have one-ton prop by Serra in the back, and Carl Andre's reef, styrofoam reef in the far back, and a Keith Saunier on the right. Ryman was in the show. This painting was in that show. So somehow, as a post-minimalist, if you will, a process artist, somebody who is not just making objects, but as Rob would say, not what, but how. The process of making is entering. It allows this work to be visible within a post-minimal frame in the late 60s of process art, included in a show of sculpture. I can't resist showing the Dwan Gallery because I'm working on that, but it was obviously a very prestigious space. It's one of the last shows at Dwan. So he's kind of really coming into a public visibility kind of late, if you think about it. Now the Guggenheim show that Rob saw in '72. Documenta 5, very important documenta with many of the so-called minimalists, sculptors and painters included. And so by the 80s, he's a canonical figure. And what's interesting, Courtney's talk about these objects that he's making, as Courtney pointed out, he's making them kind of way after those debates in minimalism around the object. He's following the course of his own work. It's not 1965 anymore when Donald Judd talks about the object. It's much, much later. And he's pursuing his own work and resulting in these very unique sorts of reliefs. And then working right up into the end in this very methodical or also free way, a way that is both consistent and yet has a lot of freedom within it. And so I think it's worth thinking about these two artists together, their two itineraries, and to think about, on the one hand, an artist who is working very methodically within a kind of more narrow set of parameters in which a lot of freedom is being found. And on the other hand, an artist who's not setting any parameters for his work and a kind of explosiveness in the work that seems ultimately a lot less rigorous to me. It is 3:15, and because we had coffee and so on, my time is dwindling. And I have no conclusion to this, but I welcome the other participants up here, and let's talk further about the show and about their papers. I have a question, and we have two curators of Ryman's work here, and we know about your retrospective in 1993, Rob, and we know about your show, and I'm wondering, what does it take to curate a Ryman show? What does one seek as a curator in organizing? How do you hang these works? How do you express the difference in the work, the continuity in the work? What are the particular necessities of curating a Ryman show?
Do it. No, you do it. Come on, you've done it more recently. It's your show.
So this isn't fair because I cheated in working on this show because I had the benefit of having seen the '93 show. And I also strangely had notes when I wrote in a lot more clear fashion, apparently. And one of the things that I remember from your show was that this sense that if you had a preconception about this person before walking into this space, it was completely blown by what was presented to you. And I might not have remembered everything that I saw, but I remember seeing Ryman's after having seen your show and thinking, oh, well, now that makes sense. Because I understood this, that your show gave me a lot of structure, in fact, about thinking about him going forward. And so in all the years since '93, I think that I came to thinking about this show. In some ways, it's no different than thinking about how do you hang any show by any single person. What's presented to you? How do these works look relative to the space? But I do think that that with someone like Ryman, that you're working against all of these, which I find incredibly bizarre. This idea that this person is an limited in some ways, that he is, that everything's white. Have you looked at the work? That's the part for me that's quite difficult. I think also, and this, I know that we've been talking about this recently, this idea of minimalist painting. He, for me, in fact, he feels like someone who destroys this sort of binary. And I think that is really important. I think that helped me think through the show, because I did not have to think, oh, this is a painting show in one sense, or this is a show that is mixed objects, or this is, I didn't have to do all of that kind of work, because I could only sort of work with what was given, right? So you just look at the objects that are available without, I think, without deciding that they are something else, in a way. That sounds incredibly vague, but it's true. Now, you tell us how it's actually done, Rob.
I would say that, first of all, I just sort of get Bob's work. I do. I mean, I don't know how that happens, but I just do. And so when I hung the show, I hung it with Bob. And we worked through the rooms, and I mean, he's a jazz musician, as you know. I'm not, but I understand what the kind of interplay musicians can be. My wife's a musician. So basically, we just moved from space to space to space, and I would make suggestions, and he'd go, yeah, no. And he'd make a suggestion, I'd go, yeah, no. And it was very, very inarticulate in some ways, because we were both completely focused on spaces and intervals and so on. We could, and I can probably still, adjust a painting by, a 16th of an inch and know that it was better than if it was 16 inch in the other direction. And that's the way we move through the space, and the work is made for that, right? One thing that was significant was this is a show at MoMA, and MoMA had never done a show with no object labels. And I was determined to follow that precedent, which had existed at DIA and it existed in Bob's other shows and so on. And there was a certain amount of consternation about it, but I said, we cannot have what amount to little commas after every object that says who it belongs to. And the nice anecdote was that, of course, there was some discomfort among the collectors. They came into the show, they didn't see their name on the wall, until Ronald Lauder, who owns quite a lot, walked in and said, I like this. And when the president of the museum, who owns a lot of art that's on the wall, doesn't have his name on the wall and says he likes it, everybody says, oh yeah, we like it too. So, it broke ground for MoMA. They just did it with Picasso. And I, frankly, would hang all of my shows that way if I could. But, my concern in hanging it was that it be such a show that people wouldn't need labels, that they would navigate from work to work to work, from room to room, from episode to episode, and find their way comfortably with some surprises. So you ambush them around a corner with something they're not expecting to see based on what they just saw, but at the same time with something that they could understand in light of what they've just seen. And that's, and the thing is that Bob's work is so vast, you can hang, dozens of shows and it would be different objects in different sequences, but I think that rule of thumb is probably the right thing. The other thing is that MoMA had a standard 57-inch high hanging rule, which, the art handlers would do automatically, And I had to break their habit of doing that in my first exhibition, which was a collection show. I did Dorothea's neighborhood piece, which doesn't, hang it, but, it was in it. There was a lot of work in that show, and I varied the heights, all the way through it in order to make room for things and also to give them room from each other. So when it got to Bob's show, it was like, for me, just normal. And by that time, the art handlers knew that the first question was, well, where do you want to start, Rob? Up, down, whatever. And it was easy. And then you go left, right, hanging off symmetry, off axis. If you think about his work, it's a grid. I mean, there's a grid implicit in everything he does, and he's almost invariably asymmetrical. Not always, but almost always. And therefore, if you're going to have asymmetrical work where symmetry is implied, you then move into rooms and you do the same thing.
I will say that I wanted people, I was overwhelmed in some ways that most of the larger scale works have not really been seen together in any way, even if you've seen one, but I think that if you see one large scale work and then you see another one much later, you don't necessarily think this is someone who works on different scales. And so I wanted that first room to feel as if you were tightly squeezed a bit, so that then when you get to the second gallery, there's a kind of release. Yeah.
And I think that's apropos of what your paper was about. It's like there isn't a distinction to be made between what is a painting, what is a drawing, what's big and what's little. Each one of them holds its own ground and hooks back to other things around it in its own way. So the minute the viewer understands that this is not the sketch for that, or this is not the lesser version of that, or whatever it is, but that they're all in dialogue with all the others, then they understand the work and they understand the logic. I'd just like to inject one. I am a source of an historical mistake that you made, so I will first of all take responsibility for it, and secondly, I hope clarify it. Bob did not buy back from Gertrude Miller that painting. She gave it to him. And she was pissed at me. That's why I remember it so vividly. I put it in the catalog by mistake, and then I heard about it thereafter. And I apologized to her and so on. So, but no, actually, and by the time she'd bought it for $80, I think it was written on the back. By the time she gave it back, it was worth thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. Now, she was Gertrude Mellon, of course, so she had some resources, but she very, very generously said, basically, I've had this for a long time, I've enjoyed it for a very long time, I've gotten from it what I need, so it's back to you where it belongs. I think she's dead, but if she's not, whatever.
But I think in the first room of your show, the painting that Allegra showed, the small one in the back, 58, and then the larger painting, wasn't that from the 80s on the left?
Yes.
So, there's something being said there. What is being said? Is it that this is a consistent project from start to end, and it's one project? Or is there a development? What would it be like to have a huge Ryman retrospective with each series, leading one room for each series and so on? Or is it better to do it the way you've done it, to sort of make connections of works from different times?
I have to say, I was really scared to put Gertrude Mellon into the show. That's the one that Allegra showed that you're talking about. I was scared to put it into the show initially. I'm very attracted to it, but I really had this mistaken belief that people had already seen it because it was in the 93 show. And I thought that because it's such a wonderful object, I thought it just circulated a lot. And I have to say, I thank Jessica for suggesting, there's a wall that needed one more work well before, in a good way, well before we got to the stage of actually hanging the show. But I'd wanted to put it there for a long time, and then didn't want to. I wanted to resist that feeling because I didn't want to feel like I was overdoing something. But apparently, people don't remember 1993. So
I can barely remember it.
yeah, I know. It's fine.
I wanted to ask you a question, Allegra. So you associate Ryman's work primarily with disegno, and you sort of put it into a kind of art of making. Disegno is about making a kind of process. And I wonder if you could speak more about colore. And of course, the work is famously, notoriously without color in the conventional sense, which makes your argument potentially very interesting to me. So how do we speak about color for Ryman?
Yeah, I was expecting this question because I actually made a very specific point not to talk about color, despite my title having color in it. I wanted to talk about color in the way I react to it in Ryman's work, which is within the white, there is a full spectrum of color. So I expressly made a point of not really talking about monochrome or pure white because it's not the way I interpret colore in Ryman's work. So I spoke more about light, which is where we experience that full spectrum of color, shadow, the way light falls on particular brush strokes, the way shadows are formed by those strokes. In the drawings, the drawings are so much more colored, as we know, than what we see in reproductions. When you're with the work, you experience color in a very vivid way. There's a wonderful drawing at MoMA that I didn't show. I thought I wouldn't have time, but it's drawn on a coffee filter. It's a circular coffee filter, and which is interesting because he really was, I think, in the 50s and 60s, drawing on works that were on paper that was easily accessible and found. And anyway, it's a grid, and it's in blue. It's a blue grid on a cream-colored paper. Of course, that paper, interestingly, is a very cheap type of paper, and it's fading, which adds an extra dimension to color in his work, which is that it's not necessarily, the color of the paper is not necessarily what it was when he started, but it's still creating these nuances. And the drawing, I believe, is called, it's called The Name of the Blue Pencil he's using, and now I'm forgetting the blue pencil, but it has this wonderful variety of tone and color in it. But yes, I think the reason I didn't talk about just the white and the spectrum and the colore in the way we interpret it is because the colore and the color is really found within that full spectrum of whites and lights and shadows that he uses.
You said, James, I think there's a third character in this sort of seasonal convergence thing, which is interesting. And James writes very well about Ellsworth Kelly as part of the early generative stages of minimalism, or whatever you want to call it, faute de mieux. But I think he should be in this conversation now, actually, too, because the change of status of Ellsworth and his work in recent years is representative of the retreat of the positions, or the falling apart of the positions, that Judd and Stella launched in their conversation with Bruce Glazer. The antipathy to composition, the sense of an American art versus a European art, all of this kind of stuff was an understandable moment of bravado. Young men are like that, right? When you're taking over and killing the fathers, the first thing is just kill the father bloody dead if you can. And so what they did is they launched this wholesale assault on previous styles of geometric art, of systemic art, and so on and so forth. But the problem is, and I think there's a pathos to Frank's work, is that he couldn't live up to it. He made amazing things. I mean, I own 3 prints of his, and I love them, right? But he couldn't live up to it. So he got lost along the way because history kept not going in the directions he said it was going to go, and he kept finding he was not ahead of the curve, he was behind it. But then Bob and Ellsworth, who were very methodical, stayed, as you say, quite rightly, in their hedgehog position, kept making fresh, remarkable, and actually very innovative work. So there's a kind of human drama here and an artistic drama. And I am an art historian, but I'm a counterpunching art historian. So I think here art history is there to tell us that predictions in art history are to be mistrusted, but that art history is in fact saying what happened and also what didn't.
Yeah, Kelly, there was one work reproduced, a painting called Giza, in an essay of Judd's. But I don't think Kelly was understood, and of course he had been in France and had his own itinerary, which was cross-Atlantic, and from what I've heard wasn't too thrilled when suddenly Stella emerges, and here he'd been doing geometric painting for 10 years.
I don't think he was thrilled, but there was a kind of sweet event about 1.5 years ago when Frank and Ellsworth met in a situation where I was present, and it was Frank's moment. And actually, I apologized to Frank for some things I'd written about him which were mean. I think they were true, but I said them in a particularly mean way. I, too, was a young man at that time. and I apologized. It was a nice event. And then Ellsworth got up in the back of the room and started talking about what Frank's work meant to him. And in fact, Frank spoke at Ellsworth's memorial. So I think there was a kind of reconciliation down. But again, the art historical arguments that reflected this clash have not altered one iota. And that's the thing I think is the problem. Art historians should be also responsible for correcting their own deviations from, plausible, truths.
No one teaches you how to do that. That's
You
the
have to do
problem.
just that-
You have to learn. You have to know that for yourself and figure that out.
Yeah.
But no, there's not a pedagogy that gives you that kind of map.
But we can start one, don't you think?
Yeah, no.
And I think one of the great incentives is being embarrassed, right?
Yeah.
If you say something that's just unbelievable and you're embarrassed by it, then you don't do it a second time and you try and go and, I apologize to Frank for being a stinker, He was far more powerful than I was, but I had made a mistake. And it was a mistake of tone, not of substance, but it was a mistake of tone. And I think a lot of these are overstatements of partial truths.
Isn't it also the difference very much temperamental? I mean, I think you who know Ryman well, we're getting into that a bit, just that you put it very well. You said he was trying to make the things he was trying to make, a kind of tautological way of framing it, and sort of in his own kind of space and not really thinking too much about the discourse around him. Is that?
Well, Bob is aware of that, I think, or has been aware of it, and I think he's very articulate when he chooses to be, but he was not like Morris and others, somebody who thought that manifestos would do him much good, and he was probably wise to avoid them, because in fact it kept him focused not on the argument about painting, but on the painting. Now, there were, I think some of the things that Judd said are absolutely brilliant, but I also think some of them are really, really wrong. And so I think it's a gamble that artists make. Did Futurism come out the way that Marinetti and others said it was going to be? No. Are the Futurist manifestos important? Absolutely. So I think it's a question of who writes the manifesto, in what context, and also at some point to say, as invigorating as this was, it turns out not to have been predictive.
So anyone in front of us wants to raise some questions? Go right ahead.
Hi, first of all, thank you for such a great day. Mr. Story, you said that Ryman was repudiating art historical narratives and also sort of personal developmental ones. And then Ms. Martin, you said he's concerned with permanence, fixity, duration, and stability. And I wondered if there's any temporal aspect of his work whatsoever. Is there, we know that white is fugitive, and so is there a temporal element?
Question. I like to think so, because I assume that we're all actually seeing different paintings when we're standing in front of the same thing, because we are seeing it at different times of the day. We are seeing them with different eyes. We are seeing them with our, there's a quite emotional quality to seeing that work, because if I am tired, I obviously see something very different than I do if I am refreshed and awake. So I imagine that has to always be there. What he thinks about that, I can't tell you, but. I think that perhaps the sort of temporal nature of it actually lives with the viewer. And maybe this is also why, to his credit, he asked that work be displayed in natural light, so that you do put all of that onus onto the viewer and not on to him completely.
Walter Benjamin defined aura as being a dialectical relationship between the unique individual viewer, the unique individual object in physical space and time. Bob's paintings, I think, bring that to a head. I think all paintings have that auratic quality to them, and I think the misuse of the Benjaminian term by a lot of postmodernist criticism has tainted it. But in fact, Benjamin was a believer in aura and believed that objects had such things, and they believed that it was a dynamic relationship rather than a static, thing that you worship. And to answer your question, I've been looking at his work for more than half of my life, and it changes every time I see it, and I change in between times seeing it, and so it becomes a kind of way of taking my own pulse as well as a way of, thinking about these things again. And I think art that physically survives is capable of doing that. And oddly, he's a pretty good technician. In fact, a very good technician. His paintings have not aged badly by and large. Some of them, were risk-taking paintings and so on, but what you're seeing now is close to what it was when it was made. And I think that's also important, because there are clearly paintings like Mondrian's where the damage over time was severe and where the repairs were worse than the damage. This is true of Reinhardt's paintings. The repairs done to Reinhardt's paintings are worse than the cracks that appeared in them. With Bob's work, you really, by and large, you're dealing with a pretty close semblance of the thing that he made. And that means time, in that sense, is suspended.
I saw another. Did you want to ask something?
Yeah, I just wanted to use what Dr. Meyer said in his last remarks as a starting point. He talked about the notion that the Rymans were more rigorous than the Stellas. And I think the issue is not more or less, but a definition or a broadened definition of what we mean by rigor. And I would argue that Stella is rigorous in a different way than Ryman is, and we need to understand that different way. And to understand that, if I might be a little presumptuous, Stella is very interested in complex systems, and the kind of rigor you get if you're oriented towards complex systems is very different than the kind of rigor you would get when the emphasis is on design. So what Stella is dealing with are broader strokes and complex relationships at a more molar level. And so I think they're both rigorous, but rigorous in different ways.
Can I just push back a little bit? I think Stella's problem is precisely that he's not sufficiently interested in the making of his work, that once he's programmed how it shall be made, he then doesn't have what amounts to quality control. And that means that many of the effects that he sort of programs into his idea or into his composition just don't take place, you know? And that is rigor, right? I mean, the rigor is that you think about it in one way and you make it as good as what you thought about. And I don't find that that's the case in nearly enough of his work. I'd like to throw one other thing too in terms of questions of I don't know. The installation of his work is predicated on its freshness. You know, a good installation like the one that Courtney did has to be fresh. Now, one of the problems is that some of his work has to be recreated in small elements in order to get it there. And I distinctly remember when I was installing one of the pieces, it was a big canvas, painted canvas surrounded by wax paper taped with pieces of masking tape. And the art handlers at MoMA are very good. And so they had taken the 8x12 or 8x10 black and white glossy, and they were trying to calculate from the glossy the exact intervals. And Bob came in and come on, forget that. So the same thing happened once with a Morris piece made out of bedding material. It was flat, and so somebody had to come and fluff it, right? And Bob was kind of fluffing his own painting. So one of the tricks in producing this kind of work in recreated form is not to be literal in your recreation. It is to capture the sort of spontaneity built into the process that they use, which means you take some liberties, but that means you're like a musician.
I think you're a more sensitive viewer of Stella's work than I. I see the aspiration to complexity, but I don't see the system. I don't see what's binding it together yet.
I have more of an emotional comment, and then perhaps it will lead to an association, or perhaps it will just remain as a comment. I was really struck by the photographs of the old shows and the old Ryman shows at galleries, and it's almost as if it's like waking up from a dream and you'd like to go back to the past. There's just so much there that you want to enter into that world, of one of those shows, and that's really my strong emotional comment. And any associations with that. It's very powerful to see those images.
Your dream, if you can be in my dream, is that
to see what it was like.
I think Naomi has a question. Naomi, can you hold for the microphone just so we can?
Thank you so much. I think everybody's talk has been extremely stimulating, and it's going to be endless going forward. Talking about the installation and talking about the innovations of Bob, the fasteners, including the signature, the lighting and the shadows, the wall, and finally the space, which means you're including the viewer. So what that leads to with what you all already intimated was that is rhythmical, Bob's a musician. If he's painting repetition, it's never exact repetition, but you get it because you two are moving through the show, looking this way, this, you move that way. So really including the viewer in that, you said everything, but I mean, the word is rhythmic. I think that's so close to the core of it.
Anyone else? We've got just a few more minutes.
We had a question here. The gentleman with the watch. Yeah.
Oh, I was just wondering about the blue line. Excuse me, the blue chalk line. Speaking of installation, a gallery technician did that, because I understand that some of the works with the frames on the stapled linens, right, of which I can't remember the title of it, but with the blue chalk line.
Arista.
Arista, right. Could you just confirm who made the blue line?
Megan, do you remember who actually did it, though? Did you have more to say on that?
Well, it's just related to that. I mean, what struck me are the instructions that are left with these works, and so that whoever made that blue line must have followed some very clear instructions.
Just to share, I've seen some of those instructions regarding the staples. Ryman has written, a thing should be measured by eye so it doesn't look stiff.
Amy Baker Sandbach and David Gray have made the catalog raisonné, basically. And as a part of the catalog raisonné, when it's published, you will also get both interview material and notations made about how Bob intended works to be installed, how he did install them. And so there'll be a lot of that. It's impossible to answer all those questions, but one of the concerns of the foundation is to make sure that all of the available information is available. And there was a particular handler whose name I now forget, who came with the Tate, who did a lot of note-taking on this issue as well. So, you know, in the fullness of time, all of this will be available. And, you know, but then, of course, you know, there's Saul Lewitt's teams that are out there making work according to Saul's instructions, you know, and it's partly something you can tell, and it's partly something you just have to show.
One more, thank you.
Yeah, I was interested in something, Rob, you said earlier today, that there's a difference between the sequence in Ryman's work and its development. And I was just very curious to hear how you make that difference between sequence and development. Because I think sequence I can understand, it's kind of related to series maybe, but how do you understand Ryman's development?
Again, I'm taking some liberties, but not too many. A development presumes that there is a goal towards which you are heading and that there will be the full flowering of something when you get there. The sequencing of work is that you are doing different things at different times. The order may be very significant to the artist, but it may be unknowable to the viewer. Or it may be relatively unknowable or, in fact, distracting to a viewer who knows those things but doesn't understand the work better because they know it. Why on a given day Bob would choose to move from this material to that material, I cannot say. I can guess, but I'm not sure how much that helps. And I think that in any case, an argument about his work that's based on the sense that he went from here to there knowing that he was going from here to there would be a mistake. Somebody once said something on the order of, an artist is the kind of person who, in order to get to B, goes A, Z, H, J, B.
I think that's it. Thank you.